Something about Brian Wilson's death just doesn't sit right. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't peaceful. And when you hear what really happened, you'll never listen to his music the same way again. Brian Wilson was the mind behind the Beach Boys, the genius who gave us the sound of Endless Summer. To most people, he was the quiet one, the brilliant songwriter, the troubled genius. But now that he's gone, there are parts of his story that are finally coming to light. And they're honestly shocking. This isn't just about how he died. It's about what his final months really looked like, and the truth that got buried under decades of silence. The public version of Brian Wilson's story has always felt incomplete. People knew he struggled. Mental illness, drug problems, family issues. It's not exactly a secret. But after decades out of the spotlight, many fans assumed he was living a peaceful, quiet life in his final years. Then, the news broke. Brian Wilson had died. And at first, it seemed simple. Natural causes. Old age. He was 82. But as more details came out, things started to look way more complicated. It turns out, Brian hadn't really been okay for a long time. In fact, for the last year of his life, he wasn't even legally allowed to make decisions for himself. Yep, you heard that right. Brian Wilson, the man who wrote God Only Knows, spent the last months of his life under a court-ordered conservatorship. And barely anyone noticed. Let's back up a bit. In January 2024, Brian's wife of nearly 30 years, Melinda Wilson, passed away. That alone would be heartbreaking for anyone. But for Brian, it was especially devastating. Melinda wasn't just his partner, she was his protector. She had helped him navigate decades of mental health struggles. She kept him grounded. She handled the business side of his career. She kept the vultures away. And then she was gone. Within weeks, people close to Brian noticed something was off. He was confused, forgetful. He didn't seem to understand what was happening around him. One of his daughters said he'd ask the same question multiple times in one conversation. At first, they thought it was grief. But it was more than that. By February 2024, just a month after Melinda's death, a judge in Los Angeles placed Brian under a conservatorship. That meant the court had officially decided Brian couldn't take care of himself. Two people, his publicist Gene Sievers and a longtime family friend, were appointed as his conservators. They were now in charge of his medical care, his living arrangements, and all his finances. It sounds like something you'd hear about a pop star in crisis, but this was Brian Wilson, a musical icon in his 80s, slowly slipping away in private. The court documents listed his condition as a major neurocognitive disorder. That's usually legal language for things like Alzheimer's disease or late-stage dementia. It meant he couldn't make sense of the world around him anymore, and he couldn't make decisions about his own life. Fans didn't find out right away. The conservatorship wasn't some big public announcement. It was buried in legal paperwork. But those who dug into the documents saw something even more unsettling. Brian needed full-time care. He wasn't just confused, he was completely dependent on others. His doctors recommended that he stay in his home under 24/7 supervision. This wasn't just about memory loss. This was about the slow fading away of one of the greatest creative minds of the 20th century. And here's where things get really complicated. Brian's death wasn't announced right away. And when it was, the official statements were vague. No cause of death, no timeline, just a short post from his family saying he had passed peacefully and was surrounded by love. But if you read between the lines, something felt off. A few days later, fans noticed that his estate had already started rolling out new merchandise. Beach Boy shirts, re-releases of old albums, even a new documentary was teased, just a week after the announcement. That quick turnaround raised eyebrows. Had the people around Brian been preparing for his death for longer than they let on? And if so, why didn't anyone say anything? Some fans started looking into who was now managing his estate. And here's what they found. Not his children, not his bandmates, not even a close relative. His publicist and a longtime business associate. The same two people who had been appointed conservators now controlled everything. That includes his name, his image, his royalties, and the rights to his entire body of work.
Which led to an uncomfortable question.
Was Brian Wilson really in control of his own legacy? Or had that control been taken away a long time ago? People close to the situation have stayed mostly quiet. But one former employee, who worked with Brian back in the early 2000s, told a journalist that Brian had been isolated for years. That quote hit hard, especially when paired with the reports that Brian rarely left his house and wasn't even able to play the piano anymore. Think about that. Brian Wilson, the man who once built pet sounds practically by himself, who arranged harmonies that changed pop music forever, couldn't remember how to play anymore. That's not just tragic, it's gut-wrenching. Here's the part that truly stings. Brian Wilson didn't just fade away because of age. He faded away quietly, behind closed doors, surrounded by people who had full legal control of everything he ever created. And yet, right after his death, the business machine kicked into full gear. Streams of his music surged. Vinyl reissues were announced. News outlets ran features, fans bought merch, and money started pouring in. Not to Brian, of course, but to the people managing his estate. One fan on Reddit wrote, "They were ready for this. The second he passed, it was like someone flipped a switch." And maybe that's just how the music industry works. Maybe it's not personal. But when you look back at Brian's life, it's hard not to feel like it was always personal. He was pushed to tour when he didn't want to, pressured to stay in the public eye when he just wanted to rest. And in the end, even his final days were managed like a business. So the real question is, was Brian Wilson ever truly free, even in death? Brian Wilson's life was a mix of beauty and pain. His music gave people joy, but his real story is full of darkness. Battles with mental illness, manipulation, loneliness, and at times complete loss of control. And now, with him gone, we're left with a hard truth. The people we admire the most are sometimes the ones who suffer the most behind the scenes. Brian wasn't just a music legend. He was a man who tried to hold on to himself in a world that constantly tried to take pieces of him away. He gave the world music that still makes people feel something, decades later. But in return, he paid a price, not just during his career, but all the way to the very end. Make sure you click like and subscribe button so you won't miss the most updated celebrity news.